Welcome to our fourth session together. Let's take a quick look at where we've been. In our first three sessions, we did this. We covered early Genesis, the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, from slavery in Egypt to the Exodus to taking the Promised Land. In our last two sessions, which start next week, we're going to do that over there. That's the Gospels and the early church, so the letters and Acts of the Apostles, which means what's left for tonight. We got to cover that tonight. But luckily, it's kind of sparsely populated, so it's not going to be quite as dramatic a jog as you might think. We'll cover it. So the overview is this. Now that they've taken the Promised Land, the Israelites have sort of a chaotic beginnings in self-rule. So we'll be looking at the book of Judges. And then we're going to look at the three main kings, King Saul, King David, and King Solomon. After Solomon, the kingdom splits into two, and the prophets offer warnings to try and keep people on track. Later, both halves of the kingdom are forced into exile, and now the prophets sort of change gears, and they're offering consolation because the people aren't where they want to be. Eventually, a remnant is able to return and rebuild Jerusalem, and at the same time, the Maccabees stand up to Greece. We'll talk about that for a sec. And then at that point, when we get to that, we will have finished the Old Testament. And what we'll do is we're going to do a visual recap of the whole thing, the first four sessions, and we'll see if it all makes sense as we go through this. Then that's the visual recap of the Old Testament. And then the last thing is we're going to take just a couple minutes at the end and examine the world stage as we await the real king, the king, Christ the King. So, Book of Judges. Now, the book of Judges starts out as the Israelites have taken the Promised Land, and as I said, it's a very chaotic time. They can't quite get things right because they can't quite seem to stay close to God. So things get messed up. In Judges, we see a pattern emerge. It's a remarkable pattern. They call it the sin cycle, or the cycle of sin. And this cycle repeats 7 times in the book of Judges. Israel has been warned against worshiping false gods and worshiping idols by both Moses and by Joshua, but they keep doing it. So the first step in the sin cycle, you would imagine, is sin. So this is where Israel abandons God and starts worshiping idols and false gods. This leads to a second step, which is oppression, where God sort of withdraws his divine protection and allows Israel's enemies to come in and take over and oppress them for some period of time. And then this leads to the next step, which is repentance. The Israelites turn back to the one true God and say, help us. So they start praying to God, which is good. And so they cry out to God in their distress, and this leads to deliverance. God raises up a judge, this is why it's the book of Judges, raises up a judge to rescue them from their enemy. Now, a judge isn't somebody like, today, black robes, they can say guilty, not guilty, or anything else like that. That's not what a judge is. In the Old Testament, a judge is like a warrior, someone who God raises up to fight for the people and to rescue them. And we'll see this play out several times. When the people are rescued, this leads to peace and extended periods of peace, 30, 40 years of peace. But then the judge dies, and it's called a cycle. So what happens? They go back to sin. They lose their way again and goes back in. So we see this over and over and over again. This is the cycle that happens 7 times in the book of Judges. And the fact that it keeps happening sort of demonstrates the fact that without the people standing with God, things are unstable. Things are sort of easy to tip over. The very end of the book of Judges, the very last verse of the book of Judges, happens to be one of my favorite. We're going to hit a couple of my favorite verses tonight. It's one of my favorite verses in the Bible, even though it's a sad verse. But it's really easy to find because it's literally the last verse of the book of Judges, and it's profound. It says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own sight. Today? Does it sound like today? Everyone does what is right in their own sight. It's a very sad statement, but it's very profound. And it always makes me a little bit sad to see it, because I see it echoed here. As the Bible says, there's nothing new under the sun, so it just keeps happening. And look at the world today. How many people that you know of are estranged from God? They don't really know who to serve, what to do with their life. It's just chasing the almighty dollar and doing what's on my planner tomorrow, but there's no real meaning. We're going to come back to that. We're going to come back to these folks that are sort of wandering. We're going to come back to it, but it's not the right time to talk about it now. But remember those people. We're going to come back. Now, as we finish the book of Judges, we go into the first book of Samuel, and that's what's next as we look at the books in chronological order, going through the rest of the Old Testament. Now, trivia, little piece of trivia. If you've ever wondered why there's a first book of Samuel and a second book of Samuel, and First Kings and Second Kings, and First Chronicle and Second Chronicle, anybody ever wondered that? Why are there two? It's because the books are so long and they wouldn't fit on the scroll, and they chopped it in two so that they could have, a scroll they could actually lift, and it wouldn't be like 50 feet long. So that's all it is. So First Samuel ends, and the next sentence is the beginning of Second Samuel. It's just a logistical thing. End of trivia. Back to Scripture. So as we begin 1 Samuel, Eli is the high priest in Shiloh, and Shiloh is where they keep the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. Eli is not the high priest over all of Israel, but he is the high priest in Shiloh, and it's a very important place. So he's a key religious figure at the time. Eli's sons would normally be taking over and be the next priest after Eli passed, but Eli's sons are not really great. They're kind of bad. They're corrupt, they're greedy, they've taken advantage of women based upon their position, so that's not a good thing. Into this, we're introduced to Samuel. He's a young boy at the time we're introduced to him, and he's a boy who's been consecrated into religious service, so he's working for Eli. And I don't know why this particular passage, when I've heard this read at Mass, sticks with me, but there's a passage I'm about to tell you about, and it sticks with me. Samuel is sleeping by the Ark of the Covenant. And while he's sleeping, he hears a voice cry out, "Samuel, Samuel!" And he gets up, and he goes to Eli, because he assumes it's Eli calling to him. And he goes to Eli and says, "Well, here I am," or "Here am I," excuse me, got to get the words right. "Here am I." And Eli says, I didn't call you, go back to sleep. You didn't say it that way, but so he goes back to sleep. And then a little while later, "Samuel, Samuel," gets up, goes to Eli, second time, no. Third time it happens, Eli realizes it's the Lord. The next time you hear that, say, "Here I am, Lord, speak to your servant." And that's exactly what happens. So we see that God calls Samuel through this very, very nice little story. Now, God calls Samuel to be a prophet and to be a leader, and over time he becomes a very well-known prophet, a very well-known leader in Israel. A prophet is not someone who foretells the future, although sometimes that does happen. A prophet is someone who speaks for God, who God speaks to, and then the prophet takes the message to the people. So he's a prominent prophet. Now, corruption and disorder continue in Israel while Samuel is growing in stature, and eventually the elders get together and they demand, for the sake of order in the land, they demand that Samuel appoint a king. And they say, they demand a king so that we'll be just like all the other nations. And this really upsets Samuel. Why? Well, think about last week when the Israelites were at the bottom of Mount Sinai, and they were about to break camp and move north towards the promised land. Do you remember what God said? God was angry, sort of, Moses had smoothed things over, but God said, "Listen, go on ahead. I'll send an angel to guide you, but I'm not going to go with you because, I'm liable to really do something nasty because you guys are stiff-necked people, right?" And then Moses intercedes and says, "No, without you, we're not distinct. Without you, we're not unique amongst the nations." So here we are a little while later, and Israel's demanding a king so that we can be just like all the other nations. And Samuel realizes this is a problem. God speaks to Samuel and says, "Don't worry about it. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. They're rejecting God as their king. They're rejecting following God. They want to follow a human being. They still haven't quite gotten it. So he says, go ahead and do that. Did I? Yes, okay. So Samuel tries one last time to talk him out of it, and he warns the Israelites that a king will demand taxes, that a king will take their sons for military service. They'll take the daughters as cooks and as bakers, and they'll take a fraction of everything they own. Effectively, you'll be slaves to the king. And the Israelites say, fine, we want to be like all the other nations. Samuel relents, and God chooses Saul to be the first king from the tribe of Benjamin, and Samuel anoints Saul's head with oil and makes him king. At this point, we've now been introduced to priests last week, prophets, which I just did, and king right now. So priest, prophet, and king. If we skip forward for a second to the New Testament, look at Jesus, he is the fulfillment, the utter fulfillment of all three, priest, prophet, and king. It's his threefold role. And he wants to share, to a certain extent, he wants to share that role with us. So as priests, we're meant to offer our lives as a living sacrifice through prayer, through worship, through acts of charity. As prophets, we proclaim God's truth by witnessing to others by word and by deed, by teaching others and defending the faith. Now, remember those folks that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that are sort of floundering in the world. They don't know who to serve. As prophets, we show them the gospel by the way in which we live. For some of those people, their only experience of God's love will be what we show them by how we interact with them. So it's important to be a prophet in that sense, to live out your life correctly. Now, as kings, we strive for holiness in our own life, and in order to build God's kingdom and to serve others in love. And as kings, you were anointed at your confirmation with oil. Remember, your head was anointed with oil. That makes you a king in order to rule through service to others. And if you weren't confirmed, or you're going to be confirmed because you're an RCI sitting in the room, that's what happens at confirmation. You're anointed just like Saul was anointed here. Now, unfortunately, Saul starts off well, but then he starts to falter. In chapter 13, Saul and the Israelites are preparing for a rather substantial battle with the Philistines, and normally they would offer sacrifice to God to help them in battle, but Samuel is delayed, and Saul becomes impatient and offers the sacrifice on his own. Big no-no. And at which point Samuel shows up and chastises Saul for having done so. He says, "You acted foolishly. The Lord would have established your kingdom forever, but now your kingdom shall not continue." He's cut off the dynasty. Saul continues to rule. He doesn't remove him from power, but his sons won't rule. So the dynasty is stopped, and it's got to be, somewhat upsetting to Saul, obviously. Now, a little bit later, Saul makes another mistake. As Saul is preparing to do battle with yet another group, the Amalekites, God commands Saul, through Samuel, to utterly destroy them. This is one of those groups that are utterly wicked, and they need to be completely wiped out. This is not a matter of taking prisoners and not a matter of spoils of war and taking stuff. You're supposed to wipe out everything, all the people and all the livestock. That's the command. Now, Saul was successful in battle, but he spared the life of the king. He sort of took him a prisoner, like a trophy, and he kept the best of the livestock. So he went through and got the best of the livestock, and he's marching back. And God, of course, knows this. He speaks to Samuel, who's far off, and says, Saul has messed up, and that he's disobeyed the command. So Samuel goes out to meet Saul as he's coming back, and he challenges him. He says, "Why do I hear all these sheep bleating? And why do I hear all these oxen lowing?" You ever wonder what sound an oxen makes? They low. It's lowing. I would have said mooing or something like that. I would have been wrong. Anybody knew it was lowing? It's an odd thing. Anyway, the Bible tells you, it's right in there. The oxen are lowing. Anyway, so, why do I hear all these sheep bleating? Why do I hear the oxen lowing? You're supposed to wipe everything out. And Saul says, well, we're bringing back the rest of the livestock livestock for sacrifice to God. And Samuel says something incredibly profound. I mean, it's just incredibly profound. He says, obedience is better than sacrifice. Obedience to God's word is better than sacrifice. To listen is better than the fat of rams as a sacrifice. And he says, because you have rejected the word of the Lord has in turn rejected you as king. So now it's like doubly. He's not going to do a dynasty, and for some strange reason he stays on as king, but God tells Samuel to go anoint David, King David. Go anoint David, but he asks him to do this in secret. It's not time yet for David to be publicly king. So God anoints David because he knows David's heart. He knows he's going to follow more closely, but he doesn't immediately become king. David, by the way, is about 15 years old at this time, roughly 15. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly, but it's roughly about 15 years old. Now, Saul's going to continue to rule Israel until his death, but he's tormented by an evil spirit at this point. David receives the Spirit of the Lord, and Saul is tormented by an evil spirit because God's protection shifts. And ironically, David becomes the harpist and the music player in Saul's court, because Saul is only soothed by hearing David play the harp or the lyre. Now, on to the story that we all know, David and Goliath. Yes, David and Goliath. So, once again, Israel's preparing for battle. This happens a lot at this period of time. And again, this is against the Philistines. Now, trivia break here, before we get into the story. Today, the state of Israel, we're talking about the nation of Israel right now, but the state of Israel is doing battle with Gaza, right? We know this, right? Gaza is a Philistine city. So they've been fighting this, well over 3,000 years. This is a long time. This is a long time going. And the word Philistine lends itself to the word Palestine. Although there are no descendants of the Philistines, because they were absorbed into Babylon and Persia and all that kind of stuff. So there's no direct descendants of the Philistines. But it's an interesting connection there off of trivia back to Scripture. Okay, so the two armies, as we get into David and Goliath, the two armies are standing on top of mountains overlooking each other. And one day, an enormous man, guess what his name is? An enormous man comes down from the Philistines and challenges the Israelites. He says, pick one of your men and have him come fight with me. Whoever wins will decide the battle. If I win, you will be our servants, and if you win, fat chance, we will be your servants. I defy the ranks of Israel to this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And of course, everybody stands up. I'm going to fight him. No, nobody. King Saul is terrified. All the warriors are terrified. They're quaking in their boots. This guy is huge. It's really obvious. This guy is huge. So this happens for 40 days. For 40 days, every morning and every evening, Goliath comes out and does this taunt. And for 40 days, King Saul and the warriors go, what's going, so they do this. Now, 3 of David's brothers are in the army. So David's father, Jesse, sends him with provisions to go to give it to his brothers and to find out what's going on. So David brings the provisions and is talking with his brothers, and lo and behold, it's time for Goliath to do his morning thing, and Goliath comes out and starts, doing all this, I defy this and all that kind of stuff. And David hears Goliath, and David turns around and asks the men of the army, why isn't anybody fighting this guy? Go. And he says one of the greatest lines. This is a great line. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? I hope if I'm in a situation like this, I can come up with something that's so cool. It's just so cool. Anyway, so despite the fact that whoever could beat this guy would be famous and probably riches and all that kind of stuff, nobody will fight him. They're all terrified. But David goes to Saul and says, I'll fight him. And Saul says, but you're a kid. At this point, he's about 17 years old. So David tells Saul about the fact that David's a shepherd. He's protected the flock against lions and bears. He's killed lions and bears with his bare hand. And he says, the Lord delivered me from the paw of the lion. He will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. So there's an interesting point here. The warriors are afraid to go one-on-one with Goliath because they see him, he's huge, he's terrifying. And they don't want to go one-on-one with Goliath. David doesn't have that mentality. He's going up two-on-one. He's going with God. And he knows with God, Goliath can't win. So David knew that God would be with him. So Saul tries to dress him in Saul's own armor, but it's a little bit too big and it's uncomfortable, and David's not used to it, so he throws it off and says, forget that. Instead, he grabs 5 smooth stones, puts it in his little pouch, gets his sling ready to go, and he goes to meet Goliath. And when Goliath sees him, he mocks him, of course, because this isn't one of the warriors, this is just a kid. And David responds, this day the Lord shall deliver you into my hand. David rushes to the battle line, takes out a stone, uses a sling, and kills Goliath in one shot, face down in the dirt. Now, if this had been pay-per-view, this would have been the worst pay-per-view ever. 40 days of trash talking, 40 days of hype and build-up, and the fight's over in 2 seconds. Everybody would scream for their money back. But this was well before pay-per-view, so nobody was upset. Anyway, when word of this spreads, the women of Israel start singing David's praises. They say, Saul kills thousands, and David kills his tens of thousands. Saul becomes jealous, and he tries to kill David. And in fact, he comes very close on several occasions. On 6 occasions, he comes very close to killing David, but David escapes each time. And on 2 occasions, David has a real easy possibility of killing Saul. Not this past weekend, but the weekend before. It was our Old Testament reading, right? Here David and his cohort are right there, and Saul's sleeping, and spears next to him, and David's right hand man says, I'll just stick him to the ground. This guy keeps trying to kill you. Let's just end this. And David says, what? You can't touch God's anointed. So the respect that he has for God's anointed saves Saul's life twice. So, but then in yet another battle, Saul's sons are killed and Saul is wounded, and Saul asks his armor bearer to kill him, but the armor bearer refuses, so Saul falls on his sword and Saul dies. Now, at this point, we're at the beginning of the 2nd book of Samuel. So now you know where they decided to split 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. When Saul dies, end of 1 Samuel, David rising to the throne is the beginning of 2 Samuel. So 2 Samuel begins with David becoming king publicly. He's out there. He was anointed earlier to sort of save the line of succession. God wanted to make sure that was clear. Now, I didn't mention this, but earlier in the book of Samuel, in Samuel 1, Samuel dies, which is a little odd because there's still a Samuel 2 to go and Samuel's not there. But it's just the way it goes. So Samuel dies, so now God speaks through a new prophet, Nathan. So through Nathan, God makes a covenant with David. And he says, I will make for you a great name. Where have you heard that before? Sound like one of the promises to Abraham, right? So God also promises that David's son will be king. And this is now confirmation that we're establishing a royal dynasty. So the second promise to Abraham has now been fulfilled, right? They've got the land, and now they've got a royal dynasty. And God promises that if David's son should stumble, he'll be chastised, but he won't be removed from the throne. And God says, your throne shall be established forever, which is true, because who sits on the throne right now? Jesus. So Jesus is the descendant of David. He's sitting on the throne right now. So the current document is Jesus. Now, David's in good shape for a while, but then in the beginning of chapter 11, there's a little ominous thing that comes up. It says, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go forth to do battle, David sent Joab and everyone else to go do battle, and David stayed in Jerusalem. This is the sign that something's not quite right, because he should be going off and doing what kings do during the springtime, and he doesn't. He stays home. So this signals a problem. Why isn't David leading his men like a king would be? But then things get worse. David sees Bathsheba, and this is a problem. So David looks out his terrace and sees Bathsheba, this beautiful woman, bathing on an opposite roof. He asks his servant, who is this woman? And they tell him it's the wife of Uriah the Hittite, who David knows because it's one of his warriors. But David anyway sends for her. She comes over, they lay together, and then a little while later he finds out that she's pregnant, because she tells him she's pregnant. This is obviously a problem, because Uriah is off at wartime, so there's no way to explain this. Uriah is off at wartime, so David comes up with this great plan. He sends word to the front lines. He says, send Uriah back. I want to find out how the war's doing. So send Uriah back. I want to talk to him. So Uriah comes back, and David talks to him for a while. Hey, how things going? And Uriah says, it's going okay. We're having a problem here. But they talk for a little while. I'm making things up. So they talk for a little while, and then David wraps it up because this is where he wanted to go. He says, okay, Uriah, go home, be with your wife, and then a little while later you can go back to the battle. And so David thinks, this is great. This covers my tracks. But Uriah doesn't go home to be with his wife. Doesn't go home at all. He ends up sleeping at the door of the palace. So he sleeps overnight on the doorstep of King David's palace. When King David finds out about this, of course, his plan's been thwarted. So he comes up with plan number 2. This time, the next day, he gets Uriah drunk first, figuring that might break down the moral fibers. And so he gets him drunk, asks him again how the battle's doing, and then when he gets him drunk enough, he says, go home to your wife. And Uriah goes, okay, fine. He stumbles out. But again, in the morning, Uriah's slept on the front door. He hasn't done it. He hasn't gone. So why aren't you going home to your wife? He says, my brothers in arms, they're out, fighting for their lives. They're sleeping in fields. It doesn't seem right that I should go home and enjoy the comforts of home, and certainly not lay with my wife while my brothers in arms are out there. So King David comes up with plan number 3. He sends a letter with Uriah back to the front lines. And this letter is sealed, which is good, because if Uriah had heard this would have been bad. The letter is written to Joab, who's leading the armies out there. He says, King David tells Joab, okay, put Uriah into send him up with the men to the fiercest part of the battle, and then withdraw all the men except Uriah. Get him killed. It's that clear. And Joab does it because he's following orders, and Uriah is killed. So God knows this, of course, and sends Nathan to go confront David. And Nathan confronts David. Nathan comes up with, to a certain extent, it's almost like a parable. It ranks right, in my opinion, it ranks right up there with some of the best parables that Jesus has ever said. It's really good. But he doesn't present it as a parable. He presents it as, here, I've got this situation. David, my king, will you please help me? Will you help me decide what's going on here? He says, tell me how you will judge this case. In a certain town, there are 2 men, one rich, one poor. The rich man has flocks and herds in great numbers, but the poor man has nothing at all except one little lamb. He nourished her. The lamb grew up with him and his children. The lamb shared the small amount of food that they had. She slept beside him, and he loves her. Now a visitor comes to the rich man, and the rich man wants to prepare a meal for the visitor. But the rich man doesn't take from his own flock. He goes and takes the one lamb from the poor man and creates the meal for the visitor that has come to visit him. David, when he hears this, grows extremely angry and says to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves death. And Nathan says, you are that man. There's nothing quite so powerful as getting a man to convict himself. And the realization of what David did hits him, and it devastates him. And so David knows there's no question that he is royally screwed up. That was meant to be a pun. He's royally, whatever. So there's no doubt he's royally screwed up. But now he repents. And in response, David writes Psalm 51. And we hear him say a couple of very interesting things in Psalm 51. It's a beautiful psalm. It says, create in me a clean heart, O God. My sacrifice, O God, is a contrite spirit. A contrite, humbled heart is what I should give you in sacrifice. So now compare David's response to what the Israelites said after they had said, we despise this worthless food, right, insulting God's manna from heaven. When the Israelites, when God sent the serpents, the Israelites come back and they acknowledge their guilt. They say, we have sinned. Please tell God to take away the serpents. No apology, no remorse, nothing, right? David, though he had definitely done evil, now offers God a contrite spirit. And he's asking for a renewal of his heart. This is a new concept in salvation history. It's a model how we should approach God when we've done something wrong. Because what do we do in confession, right? We recite the act of contrition. My sacrifice, O God, is a contrite heart, contrition, a contrite, humbled heart. So we recite an act of contrition in when we go to confession. But it's interesting that it's called that, because the act of contrition actually includes both attrition and contrition. So first, we say we're sorry for having offended God, but why? Okay, and this is the difference between attrition and contrition. First, we say because we dread the loss of heaven and the pains of hell, right? That's attrition. We fear the punishment. But then we say, most of all, because our sins have offended thee, who are all good and deserving of all my love. That's contrition, the regret and remorse that we have because we've done wrong by God. Both are valid reasons to confess sins. Attrition and contrition will both get you absolved, okay, and legitimately. But contrition shows a greater spiritual maturity because you're doing it out of love instead of out of a fear of punishment. So even if you start off with attrition, you hope to get to contrition. And this is where David is here. When we are loved by God, we should want to love him back in return. So David gives us the first glimpse of contrition in Psalm 51. David, by the way, wrote about half the Psalms. Not all of them, but about half of them. Now, as we begin the first book of Kings, David is near death. And he asks that his son Solomon, should be anointed king. In a dream, God comes to Solomon and says, ask what I shall give you. And Solomon asks for wisdom. Right. Solomon asks for wisdom. Does that make God happy? Yes, it makes God happy, because Solomon has asked for wisdom so that he could rule the people well. So God is very pleased with this and makes him the wisest man that has ever lived up until that point. And Jesus takes the cake later. Where are my notes? So it pleases God immensely, and Solomon's famous for his wisdom, and he's credited with writing some or all of the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and so he's known for wisdom. Now, Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem, and the temple in Jerusalem is the center of worship. This is really important to get. The temple is the center of worship. And Solomon's early reign was marked by divine favor and wisdom as he helped to unite the people in faith. But in his later years, things got bad. He had 700 wives, 300 concubines, 1,400 chariots, and he amassed a great deal of wealth. 666 talents of gold. Interesting number, isn't it? First time it shows up in the Bible. 700 wives and 300 concubines. I don't know how he has any time for chariots, but it's you got to have a planner. How many of my wife's birthdays are today? It would be very odd. And just in case any of you are curious, because I'm a math and science guy, I love numbers. I worked out what 666 talents of gold would be in today's dollars. A talent of gold is about 75 pounds of gold. So 666 talents of gold works out to about $2 billion back then. So anyway, so all of these wives and concubines and all of the chariots and all the money basically indicates foreign alliances through the various foreign wives, a focus on military might, and a big focus on acquiring wealth. This led to a heavy taxation in Israel, which led to discontent, to say the least, amongst the people. And in his later years, his hundreds of foreign wives led him into idolatry. So it gets even worse past this. So when Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam becomes king. Now, there's a man named Jeroboam. It sounds like they're brothers because it rhymes, but they're not. Jeroboam comes from the northern countries, and he and a cohort of his come to Rehoboam and basically say, your father was very hard on us. If you lighten our load, we will serve you. And Rehoboam says, give me a couple days to think about that. And he goes and he meets with his elder counselors, the elder statesmen, the ones who know things. And the elder statesmen say, yeah, you might want to lighten up. You want to be able to work with these people. So go ahead and lighten up. Your dad was really tough at the end. Then Rehoboam goes to the guys he grew up with. These are the young bucks, and he says, what should I do? They're saying to back off, and they say, no, you got to go even harder. You got to show him who's boss. You got to show him who's a man, right? What do the young guys do? Yeah, got to flex. So Rehoboam and Jeroboam get back together, and Rehoboam says, my father beat you with whips. I'll beat you with scorpions. This doesn't go over very well with Jeroboam and the cohort, and this is when the kingdom splits. So now we are in the divided kingdom, where it used to be one kingdom, it's now two. And the kingdom of Israel, this is crazy. We've heard now Israel used as an individual's name, right? Jacob is renamed to Israel. We've heard it as his descendants, and we've now heard about a nation. Now we're hearing about it as a part of a nation. So the northern half is called the kingdom of Israel. The southern half is the kingdom of Judah. In the north, the capital is Samaria, and in the south, the capital is Jerusalem. And if you study this period, it's important to pay attention where the story is going. All through First and Second Kings, the story sort of like jumps up to the north, jumps down to the jumps up, jumps. So if you hear about Israel or Samaria, that's the northern kingdom. If you hear about Judah or Jerusalem, that's the southern kingdom. But there's a big problem for the northern kingdom. And the problem is that line right there, the line that divides north and south. Why is that boundary line a problem? Because the temple, what was the temple? The center of all worship. The temple is in Jerusalem. And now the southern kingdom can't get to the temple. And it's the center of all worship. So what does the northern kingdom do? How do they cope with this? They can't get to the center of worship. What do? You won't believe the answer to this one. They create 2 golden calves, and they put one in Bethel, and they put one up in Dan. That way you don't have to travel too far, depending on where you're at, and you can get to your own personal golden calf. And what they do is, and not only that they put the golden calves there, now they're back to this brought you out of Egypt. This is what brought you out of Egypt. I mean, it's just crazy. And they create new feast days, and they basically create a whole new religion because they don't have access to the temple, which is the center of all worship. So they've got a geographic problem. So during this divided kingdom is the time where a lot of prophets spring up in both north and south. Because the north, forget it, the north is in trouble from day one because they've got golden calves and worse. But even in the south, where they've still got the temple, the people still keep going in and out of idolatry. So sometimes there's good times, sometimes there's bad times. There's a whole succession of kings through the divided kingdom. And the prophets spring up to try to keep the kings and the people connected to God. One of the examples of this is a prophet by the name of Elijah up in the north, and he challenged the false prophets of Baal. And this story takes place in the northern kingdom, and Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a challenge. So he told them to go get 2 bulls, and you guys pick whichever bull you want. I'll take the other one. Whatever. You get to pick. And I want you to build a wooden altar, cut up the bull in whatever is necessary for an offering, place it on the wooden altar, but don't light the wood. Okay, this is a burnt offering, but don't light the wood. Instead, call down fire from your god Baal. And the prophets of Baal, they start praying, they start chanting, they start dancing, they start screaming, and nothing happens. And this goes on for a long time. And eventually Elijah starts taunting them and says, is your God asleep? Maybe you should cry out louder. So they do. They start screaming louder, and then they start cutting themselves. And it's just a terrible scene. 450 of these people trying to bring down a spark to light the altar. Nothing happens. So then Elijah calls the people over, not the prophets. They let him keep going, but the people that are sort of watching, come on over here. And he builds his wooden altar, and he cuts up the bull, and he puts it on the altar, and he says, this isn't tricky enough. You know what? Go get 4 jugs of water. Now, these jugs are like, there's huge amphora jugs. 20, 30, 40, 50 gallons, I don't know exactly, but they're huge things. He says, go get 4 jugs of water and drench the altar. So they pour it all over the bull, they pour it all over the wood of the altar. It's just dripping wet. And he goes, that's not good enough. Go do it again. Go grab another 4. And they come in and they're just drenched in water's all over the place. And then he said, one more time. Let's do it again. And by this time, everything is just completely and totally soaking wet. And then he calls upon God, and he says, "O God, let it be known this day that you are the God of Israel. Answer me so that these people may turn their hearts back to you." And God unleashes fire on the offering, the altar, and the bull, and the water, and consumes everything. The people fall on their face, and they cry out, "The Lord is God, the Lord is God." And Elijah tells the people, go grab those prophets and kill them because they're not good people. And they go grab the 450 prophets, and nobody escapes, and they kill the prophets. But the people believed, and they've turned now back to God. But it was short-lived because all of this is short-lived. Everything goes back to idolatry. Keeps happening. Now, Elijah wasn't the only prophet trying to warn the northern kingdom of Israel. You've also got Elisha and Hosea and Amos, among others. But the kings and the priests, they ignore the warnings. And Israel kept worshiping false gods and idols. Eventually, God removes his protection from the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. And the world power of the day, which is Assyria, they sweep in. They siege Samaria for 3 years, and eventually the city falls. And the people are sent into exile. And eventually the people, there's 10 tribes to the north, and there's only 2 tribes to the south. Judah and Benjamin are in the south. The 10 tribes to the north are sent into exile and eventually scattered to the winds. They never come back to the land. So they're in the diaspora. And Assyria replaces the population up north with people from 5 different nations, just to sort of put people in the empty land now. And these people become the Samaritans, which we know about from Jesus' day. So as we look at the map, the kingdom of Israel ceases to exist. So now we're just left with the kingdom of Judah in the south. So while the kingdom of Judah still has the temple, the center of all worship, they also fall away from God and they get into idol worship. So about 130 years later, the world power has shifted now from Assyria to Babylon, and it's King Nebuchadnezzar, and they come down and they lay siege to Jerusalem. And eventually the city's taken, and Babylon destroys the temple, and so the center of all worship is now gone. And Babylon takes the king of Judah, Zedekiah, and they're force marching the people out, and they've got Zedekiah, and they've got his 2 sons, and they right in front of Zedekiah, they kill his 2 sons and immediately gouge out Zedekiah's eyes, so that the last thing he sees is the death of his 2 sons. These are really bad people. And in 3 separate waves, Babylon takes everybody up to Babylon. Rich noblemen, poor laborers. There's a few people that are left, but almost everybody is force-marched up to Babylon. And they're now captives up there. So now everyone, kingdom of Judah is now gone, and there's not much left in the land. The prophets, while they're in exile, they continue to speak to the people. But now, because the people are oppressed and they're in exile, they're not challenging the people anymore. They're now comforting the people. Again, prophets challenge the comfortable and comfort the challenged. So it's whatever God needs to tell the people at the time. That's what the prophets are going to do. The prophet Jeremiah wrote during this period of time. And he was still in Jerusalem after many of the people were already sent up to Babylon, but he hadn't been sent. So and he wrote to those who were already in Babylon. And speaking for God, he assured the people that they would return, but not right away. He tells them that God says, in 70 years, I will visit you and bring you back to the land. And then he continues with a very famous Bible verse. And he says, for I know the plans that I have for you, says the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil. I give you to give you a future and a hope. That's Jeremiah 29:11. Very famous Bible verse. And sometimes we can feel like we're in exile, we're floundering. And that's when we need to trust God that he's going to come get us. Do you trust God, right? The theme throughout the Old Testament. But one of my favorite verses, I told you I was going to hit a couple of them. One of my favorite verses in the entire Bible comes just 2 verses later, when God says, you will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. Jeremiah 29:13. Now, why is it one of my favorite verses? Because it's very personal to me. If you've heard me talk, you probably already know I grew up in a household without faith. So I grew up without faith. For the first 48 years of my life, I didn't believe in God. But I wanted to, but I couldn't get there. Then I read one passage by C.S. Lewis, and it knocked me for a loop, and it made me see things differently. And I started an intense search for God. So when I searched for God with all my heart, I found him. So that Bible verse to me is very, very important because I know it's true. If we ever feel out of touch with God, we need to commit our whole heart to finding him again, because that's when he says that he'll make himself known, even if it takes a little trusting and waiting. The Israelites had to wait 70 years. Hopefully we don't have to wait that long, but do you trust God? Anyway, 2 quick comments on Scripture, because we're like sort of in a little break point before we start getting in another book. First of all, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we've been talking about 1st and 2nd Kings here. 1st and 2nd Chronicles are sort of parallel to 1st and 2nd Kings. They're talking about the same events, but 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles are written from the perspective of the north and from the south. So they're written in 2 different perspectives. So they'll talk about King so-and-so and the King so-and-so and King so-and-so and what happened, this, but they're written from a different perspective. So you just hear it from the other person's point of view. So we're going through 1st Kings, but if you wanted to hear the other point of view, just read 1st Chronicles. Anyway, also, almost, not all, but almost all of the books of the prophets are written during the divided kingdom and the exile, because that's when they needed to really warn the people and comfort the people. There are some prophets outside of that period of time, but the bulk of them are during this period of time. So now, while the people are exiled in Babylon, the 10 Commandments and other elements of the law become their sanctuary. They maintain their faith, they refuse to compromise, and they pray constantly. But the king there has outlawed anyone praying to God. If you pray in Babylon, you must pray to the king. And Daniel says, no, I refuse, and he continues to pray to God. His penalty for that is being thrown in the lion's den, but God protects him. And Daniel gets out of the lion's den unscathed. As 70 years pass, the power changes again in the world. Now it's not Assyria in charge, now it's Persia in charge. And God stirs the heart of the king of Persia, King Cyrus. And King Cyrus says, let the Jews return to Jerusalem and rebuild the house of God. Go back and build the center of all worship for them. So a remnant returns to Jerusalem, and they lay a foundation for the new temple. And so the people were still under Persian rule, but at least they could reclaim their land and rebuild the temple. By the way, you've heard of the Pharisees during Jesus' day. This is the period of time when the Pharisees came into being. The Pharisees are known for their extraordinary zeal for purity in adherence to the law. So, in the last period, before we get to the New Testament, the Greeks now take control of the world. Just boom, 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 boom. So that now the Greeks take control of the world because, Alexander the Great, he just sort of swept through everything. And they enter Jerusalem, and they get to the temple, and they go into the temple, and they desecrate the temple, which really upsets a lot of people. And the Maccabees rise up, led by Judas Maccabeus. And he rises up in righteous rebellion, and he reclaims the temple. It takes a couple of years, but they do that. And this story gives rise to the celebration of Hanukkah. It also prepares them for the next people to rule the region, which is Rome, right? Now, we've got a couple more minutes to go, but now, at this point, we've completed the Old Testament. So what I want to do is I want to go back and do a visual overview of what we've covered in the first 4 sessions and see if you're a little bit more connected to the story. See if this all makes sense. I'm going to go rapid fire through the last 4 sessions. So, in the beginning, God creates the world and Adam and Eve. We learn that mankind is created as the pinnacle of creation. We are made in the image and likeness of God, and man and woman are equal in dignity. Eve gets tricked by the enemy and eats of the fruit. And by eating of the fruit, she has to push away God, which is sin, separating from God. We witness the first murder when Cain kills Abel, but then Adam and Eve have another son, Seth. And we follow Seth's line down through because that's the line of promise that ends up leading to Abraham, leading to David, and leading to Jesus. Sin and violence grow so prevalent that God decides to start over with a flood and start over with Noah and his family. So Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives. But then sin grows again, and mankind becomes arrogant. And they build the Tower of Babel, trying to storm heaven without God's help. So God decides to begin again. But he's not going to flood the world again because he's given us the rainbow to promise he's never going to do that again. So he starts again with a righteous man who will eventually be named Abraham, so I'll just use that name. And he enters into a covenant with Abraham. God promises him what? Land, a royal dynasty, and worldwide blessing. Abraham and Sarah are childless, and they're well past childbearing age, so Sarah gives her servant to Abraham so he can have an heir. Hagar gives birth to Ishmael, so now he has an heir, but God promises Abraham and Sarah that they will have their own son. At which point Abraham laughs, Sarah laughs, but then a year later, Sarah gives birth to a son, and God names him Isaac, which means laughter. God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, but stops him before he does so. Isaac then grows up, marries Rebekah, and has 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau is the older. Esau sells his birthright for a bowl of stew to Jacob, and then Jacob later tricks his father into getting the blessing that's meant for Esau. This really upsets Esau. Jacob flees so he doesn't get killed. He flees up and goes up north, and he falls in love with Rachel, and he makes a deal to work 7 years to be able to marry her. But then Jacob gets tricked, and he ends up marrying Leah instead. But then he works another 7 years because he loves Rachel, and he wins Rachel. Jacob has 12 sons, which is the beginning of the 12 tribes of Israel. His favorite son is Joseph because he's the first son of his true love, Rachel. Joseph is a dreamer. He alienates his brothers, and his brothers sell him into slavery and then tell his father that he's been killed by a wild animal. Joseph ends up in Egypt and then in prison, and then he's the prime minister of Egypt because he interprets a dream that the Pharaoh had, which meant that famine was coming to the land, and Pharaoh puts him in charge of taking care of that, and Joseph manages the food during the famine and saves all the people of Egypt. When the famine goes up to the promised land, it affects Jacob and his brothers, Joseph's brothers come down into Egypt to try and buy food. And they end up face to face with Joseph, but Joseph looks different now because he's an Egyptian. He's got the ponytail thing, so they don't recognize him. And Joseph wants to know if his little brother Benjamin is okay. They haven't brought him, so he sets up a little trick to force them to bring Benjamin back. And when they do bring Benjamin back, he threatens his brothers that he's going to keep Benjamin as a slave. At that point, Judah, who was the one that came up with the idea of selling Joseph into slavery, says, no, don't take Benjamin, take me instead. So Judah has grown. Pharaoh tells Joseph, because Pharaoh likes Joseph, Pharaoh tells Joseph to move the family out of Egypt, or move the family down to Egypt. We'll give them some great real estate, and they can all live down here. And then just before Jacob dies, he skips his first 3 sons because they've done wrong stuff, and he gives his blessing to Judah, the 4th son. Now, 400 years later, we're in Egypt. The Israelites are all now slaves in Egypt, and they number in the millions. 70 people came down, but now there's millions 400 years later. The current Pharaoh, who doesn't know Joseph at all, doesn't like the Israelites, they're slaves, and he tries to limit their number and their power by having the male children killed. But one survives. He's named Moses, and he grows up in Pharaoh's household. He kills an Egyptian, he has to flee, and he becomes a shepherd. And he witnesses a burning bush, and he goes up and he speaks to God. God sends him, he gives him a mission. He's sent by God to go convince Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. Pharaoh refuses, and this is when the plagues start. The 10th plague, the killing of the firstborn throughout all of Egypt, triggers the events known as the Passover. The holy lamb must be sacrificed, and the people's names are washed in the blood of the lamb. After the 10th plague, Pharaoh relents, and he lets the people go, but then he changes his mind, he goes, chases them, but he loses his entire army in the Red Sea. The people complain after that they have no food, so God gives them the manna. They continue on to Mount Sinai, where they receive the 10 Commandments, which was the thing necessary to enter into a covenant with God, which they agree to wholeheartedly. Moses then goes back up to speak to God and to find out how he wants to be worshipped. And the people, while waiting, get impatient, so they create a golden calf. And they claim, this is who brought you out of Egypt. God hears them and nearly calls the whole thing off. But Moses intercedes for the people, and it works. Then they decide to travel up to the Promised Land, but they stop just short of the Promised Land and send 12 tribes up into the Promised Land to make sure that they can actually capture it. When the spies come back, they come back with mixed reports. 10 of them say, there's no way in the world we can capture it, and 2 say, let's go today, we can capture it. But the people don't trust that God has said that he's going to lead them and be able to take the land. So they don't have faith, and as a result, they must wander in the desert for 40 years. The people then complain about the manna that is being supernaturally fed to them, and they call it worthless food, and God sends serpents among them as a punishment. Before entering the Promised Land, Moses warns the people against idolatry, and he tells them to teach the people, tells them to teach the children. Joshua leads them into battle, and they take the Promised Land. And then just before Joshua dies, he warns the people against idolatry, but it still doesn't stick. Now, all of that leads us to what we've discussed tonight, which I assume you remember because it wasn't very long ago that we talked about it. Okay? The cycle of sin that happens in the book of Judges happens 7 times, and the people demand a king to follow instead of deciding to follow God. There are 3 kings. King Saul, who falters, King David, who falters, King Solomon, who falters, and then stories of jealousy and giants, of lust and of gold. And then Solomon's son threatens scorpions, and the kingdom splits into north and south, Israel and Judah. Israel can't get to the temple, so they make 2 golden calves and invent their own religion. Prophets give warnings, but kings and the people don't listen. Israel's overthrown and sent into exile. And then Judah's overthrown and sent into exile. While in exile, the people are consoled by the prophets and they rely on the law. Then, as we get close to the end here, King Cyrus is touched by God and sends the Jews home to rebuild, and the Maccabees recover the temple when the Greeks go in and desecrate the temple. Do you remember all of that? Okay? That's it. That's the Old Testament, guys. Now, that's... Before you applaud too profusely, that's not the entire story. That's not like every last little story in the Old Testament. It's not even every nuance of the stories that I did tell. But it does give you sort of an overarching feel of what the story is. You can sort of own that, right? You hear that a couple of times, maybe like play the video back once or twice, and you'll get it. You'll be able to know where you're at. I love the fact that I understand the Old Testament because when I hear readings on Sunday, I can make sense of them, the Old Testament readings. I can even make sense of some of the New Testament readings that refer back to what happened in the Old Testament. So it's really important to understand the Old Testament. But it gives you the main structure of the Old Testament. But now, as we approach the New Testament, much more fun because Jesus is there. Now, as we approach the New Testament, Rome becomes the world power. So Caesar Augustus is in charge, and he is the emperor of Rome. Now, this is interesting. Because his father, Julius Caesar, has been declared a god, Augustus calls himself the Son of God. And he uses Rome's military might to usher in the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which is sort of like a form of peace through domination. So it is said publicly that Augustus brings peace to the world. Augustus is hailed as a savior, and his birth is described as the good news, the euangelion. It is into this crazy world that we We look next week at a small town in Bethlehem where the true Savior is born, the true Prince of Peace, and the true Son of God. But that's next week. So thanks for listening. God bless you. God bless our country, and God bless the church all throughout the world.